I've been thinking about this lecture for a long time. I gave a miniature version, a 5-minute version last fall, and I've been developing my thinking further as the months have gone by. And so I shaped it in terms of a question. What is lost when history is neglected? I think that's a good topic to be discussing in a schoolhouse. It's very properly in a schoolhouse topic. What is lost when history is neglected? Well, the answer, of course, is nothing. Nothing is lost. Who cares about history? Why is history important? It's over. The people are dead. They don't inhabit, they don't walk the streets. Why is it important? Why is it important? So I want to come back to this. I think it is important. And I think that in history, that our history was important in the past. And it was important for a variety of really good reasons. What you've got here, some of you may remember this. You're all rather young. But some of you may remember this. These are little historic figures that Lipton tea included in the 1960s. As Canada was warming up to the centennial, the Lipton Tea Company, a private sector company, thought that there was a promotional potential in including little plastic figures of the most obscure Canadians you can imagine. Johnny MacDonald is in there, and Simcoe is in there, Sir Guy Carleton is in there, but for the most of them, I don't even know who they are. And these are mostly the explorers of Canada. But what did that say about our society 60 years ago? That a company would market itself on the idea of little statuettes. And I distinctly remember my grandmother was a Lipton tea drinker, and she used to have these little things, and she'd leave it on the counter for me. Of course, I don't know what happened to them. I presume that what happened to them was what happened to my baseball card collection. My mom threw them out. It's important. History is important, but we have to ask why. James Baldwin, famously, the Black American author, reflected on the importance of history. And he came to this idea that history is not merely something to read. History is something you live every day. It's like adolescence, when people say. You never grow out of your adolescence. You're always marked by your adolescence. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us. We're unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all we do. It frames our reference, our identities, and our aspirations. That is profound. I just said most people don't care. Some people care. People who have suffered injustice, perhaps, care more than others. I'll talk about that some more. L.P. Hartley, famously, and you'll notice I'm not quoting George Santayana, those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. I'm not talking about that. L.P. Hartley, a poet, you may have heard this quote before. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Using the present tense, they do things differently, but it's long ago. And so that is a license to be a little bit more understanding of the past generations. They made mistakes. They made terrible mistakes in some cases. Paul Valéry, the French writer, said history is the most dangerous product of the intellect. That's a heavy moment. The most dangerous product of the human mind, subject to misinterpretation, constantly manipulated, used for the most devious purposes. It's a dangerous product. Left in the wrong hands, it is a dangerous product. Very smart people. My favorite, of course, is the great philosopher Keith Richards, who sang in the last great album, Hackneyed Diamonds, "Is my future all in the past?" It's a profound statement. What is the future of our society? What is the future of Canada? A lot of people are asking. A lot of people have concluded that Canada has no future because of its past. Its past is so condemnable, so cursed with injustice that it does not even bear to be mentioned as a name. I wrote this presentation, and I've been literally hit in the face by AI over the last 6 months. I assigned my last essays at university last term. I will never assign another essay because they simply make it up. Students should go to AI and within 5 minutes generate a full essay. I can hardly argue. So I asked AI, after I wrote my presentation, I said, okay, AI, you come up. What is the answer? What is the answer to this question? What is lost when history is neglected? And this is what it came up with. You lose your collective identity if you neglect history. You lose the lessons of the past successes and failures. Makes sense. You lose accountability. If you don't understand history, you lose accountability. You don't know who's responsible for what. And that's important. You lose empathy across generations. Well, if you've forgotten what past generations had to endure, what their triumphs were, what their losses were, what their failures were, well, you've lost empathy. Why should you care? You lose your cultural heritage. Yes. You lose critical thinking about the past. And good for AI, because it's stealing my thunder there. And it offers, you lose resistance to manipulation. If you don't know history, then you do lose your ability to argue back. You have to fight the manipulations. If you have no knowledge, you are subject to manipulation. And I think that's a very important thing to remember, because there's been a lot of manipulation. I'm going to be upfront in this lecture about the gross manipulations that have taken place in this country over the past 10, 15 years. At the same time, this is AI talking. At the same time, history is not just a storage vault of facts, it's interpretation. Neglecting history can also mean neglecting the stories that should have been preserved, that should have been recorded, but who have been erased. That's important. And recovering forgotten history. That's another important thing about history. History is recorded by people who want to record it. Not all history has been recorded. Anybody who's worked in history, who's thought about history, knows necessarily that what you're reading is the product of a small interpretation of particular facts. It can only be, by definition, a surface reading, because we don't know what really happened in history. We don't know. We have an idea. We have an inkling because we've been able to find some documents, not some other documents. I mean, inevitably, if you've lived something and somebody gives you a history, you'll say, well, you're not going to get that part completely right because this happened, that happened, and we forgot that happened too. And that had an impact. Very important. So good on AI. That's why I can't assign any more essays. But does AI give us all the answers? No, it doesn't. And I think that there's other things that are lost when we lose history. I want to come to that thinking about critical thinking, that habit of critical thinking. I happen to think that historical thinking is critical thinking by its very definition. Anybody who's smart is thinking historical. And you don't have to be a historian to think that way. If you're a doctor, if you're a good doctor, you ask, what's your history? What's your family's history? You want to diagnose something, what's your history? If you don't have a doctor who asks that, you're not going to a good doctor. A lawyer will consult precedent. A lawyer needs to know jurisprudence. That is a recording of history. An engineer will judge whether a design is workable based on what's happened before. That design does not work. It crashed. It could be physical, it could be software, it could be anything. You need to think historically, you need to think critically about the past, and if you don't, then you risk forgetting. Now, luckily, there's a lot of good Canadian thinking. 20 years ago, a bunch of scholars led by a fellow called Peter Seixas, S-E-I-X-A-S, a professor of education at UBC, started to think about how do we think historically? And they came down to 6 basic rules. Number 1, establish historical significance. That's a good, important step. Some people will say, John A. Macdonald is important. Why? Because he did this, 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 and this. So-and-so, a teacher at Smashed Elbow, was not so significant. Because this person only taught a few people, and that person might have been a very good person, but the significance has been lost. Somebody who knew this person might write a biography and might convince the community that it's important, but likely he will not be able to compete with Sir John A. Macdonald. Using primary source evidence, rule number 2. That basically means using facts. Go into the facts. What are the facts? Don't lose track of the facts. When you're having a historical moment, when you're thinking historically, you got to make sure you got to the facts. Number 3, identify continuity and change. Continuity and change. Very important. This is a classic first-year university question. What established the continuity and change? What changed in Britain's foreign policy between 1875 and 1930? Where has it been continuous? Analyzing cause and consequence. That's key. I mean, any conversation you have on basically any topic is going to be about cause and consequence. Who did that? Why did they do that? Well, they didn't do that. Somebody else did that. That's important. Establishing cause and consequence. What caused the assimilation of Indigenous people in Canada? It's a big question. It's not one answer. It's many different answers. You have a discussion on cause and consequence. Why did it happen? What made this happen? Taking historical perspectives. That is basically thinking about context. Why did Wilfrid Laurier pursue this policy and not that policy? Well, he was evolving in a particular context. The international relations system was changing. He had to act. Finally, understanding the ethical dimension of historical interpretation. And this basically means be sensitive. Indigenous people will look on Canadian history differently than non-Indigenous people. You have to be sensitive that their reality has not been captured as sufficiently as they think, and they take a very different interpretation of our history. You have to be sensitive. That's the argument. You have to understand the ethical dimension of historical interpretations. There has to be an ethical approach. You do not have the authority on history. It has to be shared. It has to be shared. And this is where I think a lot of people take issue with this interpretation. History is not a zero-sum game. And I want to emphasize that. Because our decision makers in this country think of it as a zero-sum game. It is not a zero-sum game. What do we lose? So if we lose history, if we abandon teaching history to our children, we're losing the ability to think critically. We also lose a sense of our tangled roots. I'm using my words carefully here. Canada, like almost any society, does not have one root. It has many roots, and those roots are intertwined. They have generated a plant, a tree. The tree has leaves, has branches, different expressions of itself. That's important. Our roots are entangled. We cannot, we should not abide by accounts of history that simply say it's one root, or who argue that root is contaminated. So when people say Canada has to abandon its colonialist past, that is attacking the root. What's wrong with being colonialist? It is emphatically a colonialist society. Canada was founded, of course, Indigenous people were here, the land acknowledgements acknowledge that. But the French came. The French established a long-standing root. The British came. They established it. The Germans, the Italians, the Icelanders. How could I forget? They all sank roots. You can't kill the colonial. You cannot dismiss colonialism. You simply cannot dismiss it. Those roots, balled together, create solidarity. They create stability. They create a rootedness. They are rooted. They are strong in the ground. And we have to appreciate that rootedness across the country, from coast to coast to coast. Last week, this is an illustration. For 100 years, in Aurelia, in Couchiching Park, there has stood a monument to Samuel de Champlain. Champlain visited that area in 1650. It's a long story. I love to tell it, but we don't have time tonight. It's a fantastic story. 10 years ago, they came to the conclusion that it needed repair. Parks Canada, for some reason, got involved. And a whole issue started brewing about whether it was proper in today's Canada to honor a colonialist figure like Samuel de Champlain. Ridiculous question in my mind, but there it is. City Hall in Barrie has had terrible problems of dealing with this issue. They commissioned a design. Parks Canada refinished the statue. They separated the Indigenous figures away from it. They wanted to do something as they did in the Nepean Point in Ottawa, where they separated the Indigenous person that was at the base of a tall tower on which Samuel de Champlain was positioned. And what they did in Ottawa is just fabulous, just fabulous. They've repositioned them. They're both at eye level. They're fantastic. City Hall could not come to terms with things. Earlier this month, they decided they're not going to do anything. And last week, the person, of course, climbed up and spray painted it. And so the chief administrative officer had it tarped up. See what happens. The vandal basically denied the colonialist perspective, the colonial root. I think that's fundamentally wrong. Those people who have the product of colonialism have a right to be nostalgic. They have a right to remember Samuel de Champlain. When the Samuel de Champlain statue was erected 100 years ago, it was a sign of accommodation, a reconciliation between the English and the French, who had been so divided over the conscription crisis of 1917. It was an act of reconciliation, reconciled with the fact that Samuel de Champlain did visit in 1615. If we lose history, we lose the sense of our tangled roots. It's very important. And why is that? Why is this happening? There's a variety of reasons. Number one, I'm drawing here on various sociological perspectives. Number one, we've lost religion. Religion, the ritual of praying, of gathering to worship every Sunday, was a transmission belt. People came together to remember. There was a common ritual, and necessarily people developed a sense of solidarity. This was very obvious in Quebec, very obvious in English Canada. But over the last century, we've abandoned the churches, and as a result, that has eroded our historical awareness. We don't gather together and share ideas, share our experiences. Number two, we don't live with grandma and grandpa. There used to be a time when you lived with your grandma and grandpa, and grandma and grandpa would tell you about, geez, the depression was really hard. You get trouble, kid? Let me tell you about not having milk. I had that. Not getting the history from our grandparents, not living together with our grandparents. That was a common thing until about 50 years ago. People tell me it's coming back. Who knows? But that's a serious difference. Number three, massive immigration. We are welcoming a massive number of people from everywhere. They don't have a sense of our history. They can't share our history. That isolates them. And that is an important factor. They can't talk to their kids about Canada's history. And in combination with the fact that we do not teach history, and that being not Turner House to say this, we have massively ignorant students. My friend Jerry Amernic, A-M-E-R-N-I-C, if ever you're interested, go on YouTube and see his interviews with university students on various campuses in Toronto. Half the students don't even know what side we fought with in the Second World War. It's appalling. It's utterly appalling. Now they're engineers, they're architects, who knows what they do. But you should think that we were not on the side of Hitler in the Second World War. Most of them don't even know that Canadians died on the beach on D-Day. In my Canadian foreign policy course this winter, I presented a case study whether Canada should join RIMPAC. Nobody knows about RIMPAC, but in Canadian foreign policy, in my class, you have to know about it. RIMPAC is an event that happens every second year where the non-Chinese forces gather in the South China Sea as a show of force. And so the question I asked my students to discuss, should Canada join RIMPAC, a show of force against Beijing? A full third of my class said, no, actually Beijing's a friend of ours. Give me a break. It may be a trading partner, maybe a very good trading partner. It isn't. But the values of communist China are not our values. For them, it makes no difference. Why? Because they don't know history. Well, maybe I'm an old man who's trying to argue the values of the Cold War, but the point still stands. You know this quote. It's constantly repeated. Justin Trudeau's defenders will say he only said it once. For me, it stands the record. But I think the full quote is important. There is no core identity, he said in 2015, no mainstream in Canada. He was Prime Minister when he said this. There are shared values, openness, respect, compassion, and willingness to work hard, to be there for each other, to search for equality and justice. As if the two were disconnected. No, we don't have a core identity, a mainstream in Canada. How does he think these things happened? Because they were born out of his brain? It's ridiculous. But it also pointed to the intellectual poverty of this man when it comes to history. And I attribute a great deal of our situation to his impact on policy. Again, I'm talking about losing a sense of history and losing the sense of our tangled roots. Trudeau thinks that it came out of nowhere. My point is that it came from our tangled roots. Look at the immigration. I want to come back to this notion of roots and the impact of immigration. This is not an argument against immigration. It's an argument about not having history, not teaching history, not thinking history when we are welcoming so many people. I come back to my class. I swear, 80% of my class are either immigrants this year, 80% are either children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. They are craving history. They want to know history. They're just blown away when I start talking about John M. Macdonald, and I do it very carefully. I don't want to trigger anybody. But look at the number of resident admissions to Canada over the last 25 years. It is staggering. We welcome them as workers. We welcome them as support to our economy, as a replacement in our aging society. They are valuable, but they need to be taught. They need exposure. This is the growth of Canada's population since 1975. 1975, I used 1975 because it was my really first exposure to immigrants. I lived in East End, Montreal. Of course, I was in East End, Montreal. I learned English in East End, Montreal because I had little neighbors from Lebanon, from Germany, from Italy. I was raised in Saint-Léonard. Some of you may know that place, Saint-Léonard in East End. But they didn't go to school with me. I went to French school. The immigrant kids went to English school. It's when I went to high school in English, en anglais, that I began to encounter immigrants. countries. So I'm using that as a date. Look at the population in those 50 years. It's doubled. It's more than doubled. It's remarkable. Again, pointing to the changing social reality of a society that is really expanding rapidly. The number of immigrants in Canada from the global south. I use the global south again because it captures people who are outside the Judeo-Christian tradition that has been Canadian, the Canadian core that Mr. Trudeau refuses to believe. We're now at 83% coming from the global south. Again, this is not to criticize. It's simply to point out that we are not teaching history. We are not creating those bonds of tangled roots that create stability in society in the face of changing realities. It is a striking parallel, and I think a destructive parallel that we need to be mindful of. How ignorant are we? This is the Abacus survey of January 2024. A third of Canadian adults don't recall learning anything about civics in school. A third recall learning about current events. 40% recall about learning about current events. About 40% remember how being taught about institutions and governments. 37% remember being taught about roles and responsibility of being a citizen. 10% only were taught about how to discuss divisive issues, controversial issues. Then we get into the howlers. 1 in 3 believe the NDP has formed government in Ottawa at some point in the past. And 11% thought this has happened more than once. Remarkable. 75% of Canadians believe that the Prime Minister is the head of state in Canada. Again, no understanding of government, the difference between government and the head of state. In 2008, I picked up this bit from the Dominion Institute. 51% of respondents thought that the Prime Minister was elected directly. Pierre Poilievre thinks that. But that's not about it. A man I admire immensely is Lonnie Birch, the third.
Sorry, did you say Birch or Bunch?
Lonnie Birch. He was the founder of the African American Museum in Washington. A really smart man. He's since been promoted to the whole Smithsonian Institution. There must be appropriate tension between stories of real pain and loss and tragedy with those of resiliency, optimism, and hope. We have to give those of the culture a real sense of legitimacy and possibility, but also be a museum that is a lens into what it means to be an American, with a message that all of us are shaped indelibly by this African-American experience. You've got to bring back this notion of tangled roots and deal with it. As in all things, my view, John A. Macdonald was way ahead of everybody. He was asked about the divisions between Canadians, the statement that has been made so often that this is a conquered country is à propos de rien. Let's use French. Whether it was conquered or ceded, we have a constitution now under which all British subjects are in a position of absolute equality, having equal rights of every kind of language, of religion, of property, and of person. There is no paramount race in this country. We are all British subjects, and those who are not English are nonetheless British subjects on that account. Was everybody treated equally? Of course not. Was there discrimination? Of course there was. But in the eyes of the law, everybody was equal. Was there a miscarriage of justice? Undoubtedly. But the ambition was there. And in Macdonald's mind, this was an iron rule. So I've talked about the loss of critical thinking. I've talked about the loss of that sense of tangled roots. I want to talk about the loss of a sense of remembrance. We have a wonderful word in French for remembrance. It's reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is remember, but it's also saying thank you. Reconnaissance, saying thank you. And the reason I have the excellent Mr. Carney here, and I'm not partisan, not by at all, is that he proudly wears the Order of Canada. All the time. All the time. Whether he's with the king or whether he's walking into his office on a Saturday morning, he's always got the Order of Canada. Good for him. He's been thanked, and he wants to remind us that he's been thanked. My point is that because we don't know history, we have lost the ability of saying thank you. Think about it. We just don't thank people. The Order of Canada is a wonderful thing. I think it could be distributed threefold, fourfold, fivefold, sixfold. A lot of great people who are doing remarkable things. We don't say thank you. We don't say thank you to those people who make history. It goes beyond that. I have this feeling that this disability in our culture prevents us from having a sense of solidarity. We don't say thank you. When a new product comes to the market, are we the first to try it out? We are very poor first adopters. We don't adopt Canadian products. We can't even recognize products that are produced in other provinces. We still have a terrible trouble dealing with interprovincial barriers. We don't say thank you. We don't recognize each other. This is something that bothers me immensely. And I think it comes from the fact that we just don't understand history. When you have a history, when you can appreciate what people have done, you say thank you. What is wrong with us that we don't say thank you? I think it's very important. And I want to give you some examples. In 2014, I had the great fortune of living in Paris for 3 months. I was on sabbatical and I was doing some research. This is me in front of the Hôtel de Ville in Paris, a beautiful plaza, as you may know. And here I am walking on a map of the front during the First World War. You could walk and observe the great distances between the towns and see where the Germans were positioned, where the Canadians were positioned, the French, all of them. You could walk it, you could meditate it. Remember the people who died in that horrible conflict. Come back to Toronto, there's City Hall. 66,000 kids died in the First World War. Where's our thanks? Not a word. At the last minute, I was able to attend an event at U of T, varsity stadium at U of T, quickly assembled by a bunch of legions to parade a few colors, a speech by Margaret Miller, solemn speech, terrible things happened. This was on the night that war was declared in the First World War. The stands were full. It was not an official event. As far as official Canada was concerned, no thanks. 66,000 kids. It used to be 58,000 when I was in high school. It's grown by 8,000 because we now know that some of these kids died of their injuries in the 1920s. They were true victims of their war injuries. The only great thing was done by a bunch of volunteers, and I love to bring this out. A bunch of volunteers actually took the addresses of the kids who died, who came from Toronto, and they pinned the location. So if you're curious about your street, your neighborhood, you can actually go to this website and say, hey, Joe Martin who lived at this street, on this one died. And that's great. And that was done without government money. What did government money do? Well, we got an ice rink on Parliament Hill. $5.6 million. I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little bit outraged, but I'm outraged. 100 yards from the longest stadium in the world, in Riddle Canal. This is where our dollars went. It's an outrage. In 1967, the government helped fund a massive rewriting of the Canadian historical record. A fantastic series done with McClellan and Stewart that 60 years later is still eminently readable. What did it cost them? Practically nothing. A small subsidy to help McClellan and Stewart print their books. And these books are still excellent 60 years later. That's remembering. What we did between 2014 and 2018 is nothing short of appalling. You can't say thank you. What impact does that have? Angus Reid has been running with this poll every now and then, asking Canadians, do they have a deep emotional attachment? In 1991, 63% had a deep emotional attachment. 61% in 2015. In 2024, it was under 50%. Society does not stick together. There's no solidarity. That tangle of roots is not going to stick. Here's another poll, again from the Angus Reid Institute. Are you very proud to be Canadian? In 1995, just under 80%. 1995, remember 1995? There's a terrible Quebec referendum. We are under enormous economic pressure. The federal government is killing the budget. We have huge controversies over our universities, over our schools, over our hospitals. Almost 80% were very proud to be Canadian. It dropped down to just over 50% in 2016, and we are now about 32%. That's not good. If you don't tell the story, how are people going to care? How are people going to remember if you don't teach history? There is nothing more powerful than a people and a nation steeped in its history. Again, Lonnie Bunch. And there are few things as honorable as honoring our ancestors by remembering. His message, for me, is golden. What else do we lose? I'm down to my fourth proposition. A loss of a sense of what actually constitutes progress. If you don't know the past, then you think that whatever we have is just normal. It's just normal. It came about because of impersonal forces. It just naturally happened. There's no sense of destiny. There's no sense of recognition that things do progress. Sometimes slowly, way too slowly. It's taken us way too long to recognize women. It's taken us way too long to recognize the role of Indigenous people. It's taken us way too long to recognize the role of the various ethnic minorities that are with us today. What do we do to honor those people? Seriously, how many statues do we have honoring women in this city? Can you name one? I can't. Is there a statue of Laura Sequin?
Mary Pickford at the Ledge.
Mary Pickford at the Ledge? Okay, and me too. It's not enough. It's not enough. We need more. We need a lot more. I want to talk about the Dundas experience. In 2020, a number of activists started to make an argument against Henry Dundas. One of the arch mobilizers was a fellow called Landrick Bennett, and he's quoted in Toronto Life about Henry Dundas. Here's an individual who has been given massive prominence, he said. Dundas is one of our busiest streets, and young Dundas Square is a main attraction. There's even been a public school named after him, where many black students are enrolled. How can we expect them to attend a school named after someone who would probably have had zero qualms about putting children like them in shackles? That said, this doesn't and shouldn't stop at Dundas. It is about creating a template we can use to rename other streets that celebrate racism. Terrible. Here's what our mayor had to say. An objective reading of the history, the significance of this street, which crosses our city, the fact that Mr. Dundas had virtually no connection to Toronto, and most importantly, our strong commitment to equity, inclusion, and reconciliation make this a unique and symbolically important change. Great. Except here's what's wrong. Henry Dundas was the leading abolitionist of his generation. The leading abolitionist. Not somebody who's delaying abolition. He's arguing in the House of Commons that abolition should happen. It should be worked at immediately. It should be erased, he said, in 1792, by the turn of the century, by 1800. The record is clear. Time and time again, Henry Dundas supported abolitionists. He spoke in favor of abolition. Mr. Tory says he had nothing to do with Toronto. Well, had he consulted with people who knew something about Dundas, and that, of course, is bold. You don't consult experts when you're dealing with history. He would have known that Dundas, as the Secretary of the Interior, the Home Secretary, as they were called then, appointed Simcoe. What was Simcoe's first act? Outline slavery in Upper Canada. He also appointed Osgood as Chief Justice of Upper Canada, who made sure that the laws were enforced. And not least, reappointed Lord Dorchester to be governor of Lower Canada. And what did Dorchester give us? Bilingualism in Parliament, recognizing that the Catholics, the French Catholics, had a voice, had a role to play, to recognize their distinctiveness. Henry Dundas did more in a weekend than John Tory ever accomplished. And yet John Tory gives himself the authority to condemn a historical figure. It's outrageous. It is outrageous. Ryerson University, now known as Toronto Metropolitan. Ryerson's belief influenced in part, they use these words, in part, the establishment of what became the Indian residential school system. As chief superintendent of education, Ryerson's recommendations were instrumental in design and implementation of the Indian residential school system. It didn't occur to those people who wrote that to actually look into the record and notice that residential schools had been part of the Canadian experience, the Indigenous experience, since the moment of contact. Ontario had been a location for residential schools since 1829. Ryerson wrote a 4-page letter in 1847 as a response to a government request. What can we do to help Indigenous kids learn to farm? And what did Ryerson come up with? Not some colonial example, not some British or some French or some Portuguese model. He went to Switzerland, the Horwell Institute in Switzerland. He says, you know, if you want to have a good model for Indigenous kids, at this school in Switzerland, they teach them how to farm in the morning. They teach them how to handle herds, take care of the chickens and the pigs and that kind of stuff. In the afternoon, they teach them stuff. They teach them how to read and write and count and survey and mechanics. Ryerson said, no, that's the kind of thing we should have. And this was part of Ryerson's broader vision for education. Education should be for everybody. It has nothing to do with residential schools. That was never his idea. He was merely applying what he thought was the best practice in the world, Switzerland. And yet this is what we wound up with. A categorical misrepresentation of history. And that's what happens when you don't have an understanding of what actually constitutes progress. You don't know what steps were taken. My last point is that if we lose history, we lose our sense of sovereignty. And that's very important. If we don't tell our history, who's going to tell it? Is it going to be AI? 85%, 90% of AI comes out of the United States. Maybe it'll change with time. Maybe it'll change. It'll be half Chinese, maybe. The data, the knowledge, comes out of the United States. This worries Europe a great deal, because the Europeans are quite, protective of their own knowledge. Is AI going to write our history? Is that our destiny? Again, I'm quoting my favorite Keith Richards. I gotta have this. Donald Trump. He has an idea about our history. We don't have one. Donald Trump thinks that we have the history of the United States. It's just a matter of fixing the border. Otherwise, we're Americans. Fix the border, erase the border, redraw the border. Canada, he says, lives because of the United States at the tune of a $200 billion subsidy every year. How can you disagree with that? You disagree because you say, no, we have a different history. We have a different history. It is what makes us different. That particular knotting of the roots, that particular understanding. We are different from the Americans, and we have to cultivate that difference. It will only happen if we actually teach it. I'm in my last section. So, in Enoch Turner, let's talk about curriculum. The way we teach history, the way we teach Canadian history in this province is utterly appalling. Utterly appalling. If you're a grade 8 kid, because that's where you teach history, Canadian history in this province, you're going to learn a lot of stuff. One thing you're not going to learn about is Johnny MacDonald. He gets 4 mentions. Twice he's in the list and twice in the context of Louis Riel. His accomplishments in forging this country, in developing the institutions for this country, is completely neglected. What he stood for in terms of his values is rejected. Samuel de Champlain, I mentioned him earlier, 3 mentions. Oliver Mowat. Anybody who knows anything about Ontario has to remember Oliver Mowat. But really, who does? Just be a joke. Mowat had a huge hand in shaping not only this province, but this country. However, you will have 239 mentions of the Indigenous. You're going to have 41 mentions of Haudenosaunee, 6 Nations, 9 mentions of the Wendat, and 8 of the Ojibwe. The curriculum, when you're in grade 8, is entirely focused, almost entirely focused on the Indigenous reality. I'm sorry, but that's not reality. The Indigenous population constituted a very, 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 very small segment of the province. And it's not right. I'm saying bold things here. It's not right to focus on it. You give it focus, you mention it, you discuss it. But you have to talk about what really happened in society. What were the institutions that shaped Ontario? What is it that makes Ontario what it is today? High schools know better. You cover high school in grade 10, and it's a course called Canadian and World Studies, and it is focused on identity politics. To give the Ontario curriculum credit, they do borrow the ideas of Peter Seixas and the thinking historical model. And they position the various strands so that the teachers can understand. But there is no textbook. The teachers who are not expert in history, they're teaching grade 8, for heaven's sake, or they're teaching grade 10, do not understand history. They are relying on a variety of notes, but the curriculum, I submit to you, is entirely misleading. So you wind up with students who are completely ignorant. They have a sense of their identity, but they have no idea that Canada fought 2 world wars in 1914 and 1939 and lost enormous wealth and human lives. They have no idea. How do you feel about that? Who cares? You don't know anything about our history. You don't know anything. And they wind up at university, which is really outrageous. And yet, Ontario is a leader, which is even more outrageous. Ontario is one of 3 provinces that requires a grade 10 Canadian history credit in order to graduate. Elsewhere in Canada, with the exception of Quebec and Manitoba, you don't need to take Canadian history to graduate. Why are they so ignorant in Western Canada? Because they don't know their history. It's plain as day. Now, however, if you're in PEI and you're a French kid, then you have to take a Canadian history course to graduate. And if you're in New Brunswick and you're a French kid, you also have to take a history course to graduate. But if you're an English kid, you don't have to. You don't really need to know your country. It's completely outrageous. How we allow this, and this is under conservative governments, liberal governments, and democratic governments. It's completely outrageous. And yet we have had people who stood here. I'm merely replacing them. A wonderful book by Bob Davis came out in 1995. And this is what he said: those of us who are not satisfied merely to lament the passing of history in schools, just like I'm doing, must find a strategic way to deal with this absence. Jack Branston, the great historian, asked the same question 5 years later. Who killed Canadian history? Why is it that we don't have Canadian history? And what's been the response to those gentlemen? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Except maybe this kind of stuff. We've lost history. We've lost history in this country, but we've lost more than history. We have lost a sense of thinking, an ability to think, an ability to appreciate what actually constitutes our society, an ability to say thank you, to recognize. We've lost the ability to exchange amongst each other, to interpret history properly. And this is what we wind up with. In a context where nobody knows anything, any activist can pronounce himself or herself as an expert. And worse, we've allowed for the vandalism of great monuments. Monuments, for the most part, not paid for by the state, but by volunteer donations. It's a terrible state, and this is what we're up with. And in a context like that, well, what can you do except do something like this? It's a mixture. Yep. This is where my kids go for the grandkids, not my kids, my grandkids go swimming in Montreal. About 5 kilometers from where the McDonald statue once stood. And this is what symbolizes Montreal society. It's completely outrageous. It's completely outrageous. And on that outrage, I want to thank you for listening to me.